So the issue, it is not the fact that we don't have enough install capacity. The problem is that the performance of the install capacity is poor.
Hello and good evening, everybody. So I'm speaking all the way from France. I've got a very important guest tonight. It's Jacob Maroga. He was a CEO at Eskom and he left the utility in about 2009. He actually started his career in 1995, so he started with the transition of democracy. And he's been since then quite active in the energy space. He's still in the private sector, but he's also being a contributor to the public debate and the Eskom crisis in South Africa. So, sir, welcome to this channel.
Thank you, Hugo. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you. So I put the topic as tonight as just understanding Eskom, because as you know, everyone's got an opinion and nobody's worked for Eskom. And as somebody who's worked in Eskom, let me ask you then from straightforward, how do you see the challenge of Eskom? And I think maybe let's start with the history and how we got up to the run-up of load shedding.
Well, look, we can start anywhere with Eskom because, as you know, Eskom has been a key pillar of the industrialization of South Africa. Eskom is 100 years old now, and it has been part of the industrialization drive, particularly starting around the 1910s with the Union of South Africa. So the idea that to build an industrial base, you needed cheap energy, you needed cheap transport, you needed cheap steel. That was the creation of Eskom, IDC, Transnet, Spoornet, and many other related state-owned enterprise. And I think as part of that, I think Eskom did well in terms of converting local, a base into cheap electricity, abundant electricity, to build the industrial base basically on mining. I think the initial idea of Eskom came out of enabling mining based on cheap and abundant energy, and I think that's really the history of it. I joined in 1995. From 1995 to around 2002, that was also a phase in Eskom's contribution to what emerged as a democratic order. I started on the distribution side, and at that time, electrification was the key driver. I worked at distribution technology, and there the idea was, what technologies can we bring to the fore to lessen the cost of electrification? Because it's one thing to electrify affluent communities, but it's another when you go to remote areas, people who are not affluent, then you have to lessen the cost per connection. That was really the idea. That's how I started at Eskom. I worked at transmission as well, and I was CEO in 2007. And that was, just around the time when we were making new decisions about new capacity. So just to give context to the issue of new capacity, around 1998, there was this energy white paper. The first idea, or the big idea about the energy white paper of 1998 was the restructuring of the electricity sector. It was almost along the lines of Europe and particularly Britain, where the idea was to break up the vertical chain. You separate distribution, separate transmission, you separate generation. That was the idea.
So to get into the idea of privatization is not a new one in South Africa.
No. The idea of privatization of the electricity sector is not a new one. It goes back to 1998. And also on the generation side, the idea, I think it was known in 1998 already, that with the rate of growth in electricity, by 2007, we need to have new capacity And the debate was, will the new capacity or should the new capacity come from Eskom, or should we bring private sector? And the overwhelming idea is that because of the new capacity, that's an opportunity also to bring new, private sector. It will bring new capital. It will bring new skills. It will not encumber the state in terms of, bringing new capital. But, because of our unique situation, cheap electricity does not attract investment into the sector. It is good for the customers, but it's not good for investors. When investors look at South Africa, it was not an attractive investment destination for energy because of our cheap electricity. So,
but would that mean the state was more efficient than the private sector? They could be more competitive at that stage.
Well, I think I don't want to blow that horn too loud, because part of being cheap was not necessarily because of the economics, because part of being cheap was because of excess capacity, and the fact that the power station that we had built, we had already sort of written them off in the books. So all you needed, is OPEX as opposed to CAPEX, and therefore we priced it cheap. But the problem with that is that when you now have to build new and you have to price in the CAPEX, then the price of electricity was not attractive for new players. And that's when the instruction was given to Eskom, look, we can't get IPP, so go ahead and build. That's how Medupi, Kusile, and Ingula came about. Maybe let me pause there, then we can make it conversational.
Yeah, because you see, so this is the important context in my view that goes missing when we talk about Eskom. We don't look at that history. So we had 1998 government, like a worldwide trend. There was a social movement towards privatization, especially in the English-speaking countries. In France, we resisted it a bit more. But be that as it may, it happened. Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, all the type of what they would now call neoliberal ideology, if you will, in political thought, came in, and that necessarily wasn't a bad thing because it worked in the UK, maybe, or it's arguable if it worked or not. And I think another point that I would, want you to maybe elaborate on a little bit is the role of municipalities here, because you say electricity was made affordable to people. Now, in South Africa, as I understand the system, I try and understand it, sometimes I don't, it is that the municipalities collect the money and the money has to be paid over to Eskom. Okay. And if you look at Eskom's outstanding debt today, it seems to match more or less the municipalities. Okay. So how did that play a role maybe in all of this?
Well, again, historical context. As I say, Eskom's main role when it was established was to empower or enable industrialization. And at that time, municipalities were supplying their own power. So Eskom was not supplying to municipalities, or most municipalities. And if you go around the country, you'll still see the remnants of that. You'll see, most of the big cities still have, some power stations, most of them not working, but some, power stations that they used to have to supply their own. Johannesburg has got the Kelvin Power Station. When you go to, TE, Cape Town, Pretoria, you'll see that they all have their own power stations. So Eskom was doing the industrial part, municipalities were doing the residential and commercial part. But with Eskom building new capacity and with excess capacity, actually Eskom went and incentivized municipalities to close down their power stations and give them a better deal on Eskom energy. That's how then Eskom began to take over or to actually supply municipalities. But over time, municipalities became a double-edged sword. One, they were customers to the Eskom's excess capacity, but they brought a new problem of non-payment, which had to be managed. And I think is actually probably, at some point, I think we might manage it down, but it has reared its ugly head again. And the non-payment is actually becoming a big issue. Non-payment, particularly of municipalities, becoming a big issue for Eskom. So in proportion, just in terms of size of customer base, Eskom has probably 40% of its customer base come from industry, 40% come from municipalities, and the 20% is a mixture of direct commercial customers, farmers and so forth, and Eskom's own domestic customers. And most of the domestic customers that Eskom has acquired is through electrification. Through electrification, and in some cases, just before the transition, Eskom took over some of the problematic townships like Soweto, Katlehong, and so forth. So that's where the bulk of the Eskom domestic comes from. But with that came the issues of non-payment. Yes.
Okay. And when we speak of the non-payment, because I understand there's a sensitivity to this question in South Africa. Many people would say municipalities were just stealing the money. Other people would argue that it's poor people who do not have an income anyways, and we have a social responsibility to provide them at least a basic level of electricity according to the Constitution, human dignity, and all those things. So how do you, just wanted you to speak to that point maybe?
Well, the issue of non-payment come in different forms. I think let's start with at the residential. Let's just take Soweto as one example that I'm familiar with. So the issue of Soweto comes from Eskom taking over the direct provision of electricity to the residents of Soweto from what used to be the black councils. So when the councils politically were not legitimate structures to collect, and they were not collecting, they were not paying Eskom, there was a deal made with the residents and the government and stakeholders to say, okay, let Eskom have a direct role. That's when it started. So Eskom started actually having a direct relationship with customers in Soweto. The idea was some of the old debt needed to be written off, people needed to pay, but it never really worked. I mean, the Soweto problem, sometimes we try to solve it, but it just continued, So that's the one portion where it was Soweto, but many other black townships where the political legitimacy of the black councils, even before the changeover in 1994, was a problem. So there was a deal made for Eskom to supply directly. That's one level of non-payment. The other level of non-payment is with municipalities. That is, Eskom supplies to municipalities. Municipalities struggle to actually get to collect and pay to Eskom. So it's a bulk account problem. And that relates to the management of municipalities. And when you look at, there are over 250 municipalities in South Africa. And we're actually having a municipal crisis in South Africa in terms of a lot of municipalities not being able to manage their affairs, to be able to collect rates and pay bulk services, not only electricity, but things like water and sanitation and things of that nature. So it's at an individual customer level, it's at a municipal level where you have this non-payment. Yes, there's an element of affordability, there's an element of the price of electricity, but I think at the core of it, it's really administration at a municipal level, and also political issues with some of the historical takeovers of individual customers.
Okay, so I want to just add another factor in here, and then I think we'll go before we get to Medupi and Kusile, and that is we cannot ignore the fact that Eskom played a political role in the new dispensation, still playing one, and in the apartheid years. And during apartheid in particular, you mentioned the black councils, but I studied this history quite well because of the French military influence on the apartheid regime. And in particular, the fact that Eskom was used to settle geopolitical disputes. Cabora Bassa in Mozambique, which worked both ways, Lesotho in South Africa, but also internal in South Africa, the internal tribal issues that the apartheid government wanted to get some groups, if you will, in to support them, and then they were using the military against the other groups. So you had all of these issues. Now, when an economist looks at that system, they would say, well, that's inefficiency built into the system. I mean, was that the case as well? If you would look at it when, by the time you were rising through the ranks of Eskom?
Absolutely. I mean, with the policy of separate development and homeland, for instance. So South Africa tried to have little Escoms in the homelands, right? And of course, that also just create inefficiency, lack of integration, and as post 1994, Eskom had the job to actually integrate the infrastructure, the people, the systems from former homelands. And some of them came with debt problems, political problems, non-collection problems, infrastructure, quality problems. That was part of the issue. But when you talk about, one of the positive contribution of Eskom is that, so you see, until recently, as late as 2002, 2001, Eskom was not a tax-paying entity. It had a special dispensation in terms of its company status, and for that, you didn't have to pay tax. So post 1994, one of the ways of Eskom contributing was, for instance, electrification. So Eskom actually decided to do electrification out of its own cost, in lieu, for instance, of taxation. So the initial electrification program was actually funded by Eskom itself, until when Eskom changed over to become a tax-paying entity, that function of paying for electrification went into the state through the Department of Energy, Minerals and Energy. Yeah.
So I'm just scratching my head here and asking why should Eskom pay tax? I mean, what is the rationale for that? It's our taxes that we pay tax on. How does that work?
Well, yeah. Look, firstly, let's just go back to the formation of Eskom. Let's come back to the tax status of Eskom. So when Eskom was founded, I think the Eskom Act was probably enacted in 1922. It was specifically saying Eskom will provide electricity wherever it's required in South Africa, not for profit nor loss. So it was supposed to only break even, but also to provide in its books, to provide money for new generation or a new infrastructure.
Yeah.
So that's how Eskom was funded. That's how the entire electricity system was funded in South Africa, out of Eskom making sure that in its tariff it give allowance for expansion, new generation, and it did that up until 2001 theoretically. In fact, up until 1985 with the De Villiers Commission, because around 1995 it went into a crisis with bringing new capacity, so what actually happened in the early 70s, the economy of South Africa was booming because of the gold and minerals and commodity boom. And for that, then Eskom responded with building new capacity. That's why most of the capacity that we have came between the mid 70s to the late 80s. But early 80s, the economy tanked, right? When the economy tanked, you have huge commitment in terms of capital expenditure, but the economy is going down. So Eskom must not be able to collect enough to fund their capital, Then it went into a crisis, and the crisis was stemmed by, huge increases in electricity, and politically it became a problem. So there was a De Villiers Commission that says, let's look at this thing. Then they changed the model to say, no, you cannot, as Eskom, charge customers on the basis of putting some money for capital expansion. Change that model. But it was never a comprehensive change, because it never said, okay, where will the new money for new capital come from? Right? So it just says, look, be like any other corporate, but it didn't actually talk about the details. So, but because we had excess capacity, it was not an urgent question, right? So from 1985, up to recent, Eskom was not collecting money to prepare itself for the expansion. So when 2007 came, 1994 came, the question of who must fund the new capital and how it must fund it becomes an issue. Is still an issue now. I think it has not been solved because, in fact, if you ask me, the issue of a comprehensive funding model for new capital is the issue that has cost the Eskom debt. It has cost the performance of generation, because what happened is that the operational, cost, or the operational funding that was supposed to do proper maintenance of the existing fleet was actually diverted to the new build, right? And we are now in this spiral of poor plant performance and poor financial status of Eskom. So, question to answer.
No, but this is brilliant, because it reminds me of another country, which is Russia in the 1990s, where they imposed certain privatization reforms. Now, Russia was arguably systemic sabotage. It was horrible what happened there. South Africa, I don't think, went as far as Russia did. But the policies imposed by Boris Yeltsin destroyed the Russian utilities and the Russian state-owned enterprises, after the communist reforms. And that's part of why Vladimir Putin is angry today. It's not the only reason, but it's part of that issue. Life expectancy in Russia, I think, collapsed by years. South Africa did not collapse; it actually increased. So, there are differences. It's not the exact same thing. But the argument, and I would like to give you on to this, is that Eskom is, until today, ran under a wrong policy framework. We still have not agreed on the policy framework. And that includes the capitalization, as you've said, because you're saying we're basically taking maintenance money into new build, which that is why the wheels are falling off the bus, basically.
Absolutely. I think you've captured it well. The bigger issue is, what is the policy framework of running our energy system, and Eskom being part of that energy system? In the absence of you being clear about that, things happen haphazardly, right? And you see now, Eskom, the debt of Eskom, people think that the debt that Eskom accumulated, which mostly was for the build, just, fell from the sky, is mismanagement. No. In 2007, it was clear that Eskom doesn't have the balance sheet of Eskom cannot handle the new build. And the issue was, how do we fund this new build, right? And ordinarily, if the South African government was saying, I am the shareholder, it meant that the shareholder, like any other capitalization, the shareholder need to capitalize the expansion, right? But the shareholder said, no, I don't want to capitalize the expansion, collect it out of tariffs. So basically fund it out of operations. But when we went to the NESA, I remember the discussion, when we went to NESA, to say, NESA, we want to put in our operational expenses money to build new power stations. NESA says, no, you must build them, and then we will compensate you over a period on return on invested capital, not on, we can't, the cash flow for your build can't come out of tariffs. So there was a big debate. In the end, because we were committed to build, we started building, but the funding model was never fully, quantified, fully, a framework for it. So what is happening now? The fights between NESA and Eskom and the fights between departments come from what you just said, that the framework for running our total energy system has not been fully laid out, and it's now impacting on the operations, on the financial strength of Eskom. But the bigger issue is impacting on the attractiveness of South Africa as an investment destination.
So what I want to add to that is let's go back to 1998. Okay, 1998, I understand that Eskom made projections telling government that population will double by 2008, more or less, which happened. And obviously they said the private sector would solve it, which, as you say, electricity was too cheap. Private sector did not want to come in at the market at that stage. Other thing, and you just mentioned a little bit of that happened next, is NERSA. NERSA comes in, I think, 2003 and 4, if I remember correctly. Now, when NERSA came in, how did that change the operations and the powers of Eskom?
Yes. Now, you must go back and say, okay, how was Eskom regulated before NERSA came in? Right? So you could say there was a thing called the Price Control Board, but you could say virtually Eskom had the power to decide what to build, how to fund it, and what the price of electricity should be to be able to do all of those. So it had, and I make this point that so Eskom was set up almost as the power industry, right? And it was given the industry mandate to decide what to build, when to build it, how to fund it, and what the cost of tariffs should be. And you almost like you give this powers to Eskom. You say, Eskom, just make sure we've got abundant and cheap electricity. And Eskom was carrying out that mandate and making all the decisions. Now, when you now come and restructure and bring in NERSA, you're now beginning to take some powers from Eskom, right? You say you can't decide on your own what the price of electricity should be. You must apply it to somebody else. Now, my criticism is that yes, you could do that, but you must understand how all the pieces fit together. If you say Eskom, you've got the mandate to make sure that the lights are on and power is cheap, but the person who decides is NERSA. It's no longer Eskom's mandate, therefore, right? So because you've removed something important in terms of how Eskom invest and how they recover. If they have to recover from somebody, but they've been forced to invest, then there is a gap. That's why they're all this fight. Because when you look at the NERSA model, the NERSA model doesn't suit what Eskom is doing. The NERSA model says you invest your own funds, we will remunerate you on the rate of capital invested, the rate of return of capital invested. But Eskom said, no, I don't have the capital. So I need to get money out of the customers. So it's one example of when the framework is not well thought through and things begin to collide. That's why, what's even puzzling is now Eskom and NERSA are taking each other to court. And you could see that it actually becoming much more messier, but it is under the umbrella of what is the framework of how we make sure we provide security of supply, cost of electricity, and economic development as part of the mandate of the energy provider. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's very valuable information. Now the next question is, you became CEO in when? 2006, if I remember.
2007.
2007. Okay, and you are tasked with building Medupi and Kusile, right? So what were the discussions then when those two decisions were being made?
Well, let me start somewhere else, because with the aim of government, with the 1998 energy white paper to bring in private capital into the electricity sector, there was a clear instruction from Eskom. Eskom, don't prepare yourself to build anything from now on, because we're going to give it to the private sector. And that also meant, I can remember the discussion we had where we made allowance in our price applications to NERSA to say we need to provide for new capacity in terms of the pricing signal. And NERSA came back to us and said, look, you are not going to build anything. Take out anything that has to do with new capacity out of your price application, right? So that was the idea. Then at some point, we sat around as management and said, look, we know that somebody must be sitting down, even if it's not us building, somebody must actually prepare the plans so that when the time comes to invest, the plans are ready. So we then went to the regulator and said, look, we are not planning to build, but we want to ring-fence cost that is necessary to build, to plan for the new generation. And whenever you decide who's going to build, we can then take those plans and be compensated for them, but so that South Africa is not at risk of not having capacity. Because if we sit and fold our arms, we're going to have a problem. So we want to continue to plan, but we plan on the basis that we can ring-fence the plan and hand them over to somebody who must build. Because otherwise, So there was an agreement. In fact, I remember, one of the pump storage, what is the Ingula? At that time, we called it Bram Hook. So we actually call that a Bram Hook model, where we are planning as Eskom with a view that whoever is going to be tasked to build, we can give them the plans. That was the discussion, because we saw that we can't just fold our arms and we can see the system is getting tighter, but no new capacity is being built. There's this discussion about IPPs. But that also assisted us in a way that, because we did that with Medupi, we did that with Kusile to continue to plan. And it was clear from us sitting inside and the amount of work that needed to happen and these price differentials. It was clear to us that it's quite possible that no one is going to step in. And at some point, we're going to be asked to step in. So almost like, preparing ourselves. So then, a decision was made. If I remember well, I think this was probably 2004, 2005, when actually an instruction was given to say, hey, we see we're going to have a problem in 2007. We have not been able, that's government now, we have not been able to create a model for the IPPs. So please go ahead and build Medupi, Kusile, and Ingula. Those were the 3 stations. And that's when we started. Then we actually went to government and we spent a lot of time to say, how do we fund this? All right? As government put in money, because we don't have the money in our, there was an old model, which was called the Capital Fund. Where Eskom was having a kitty to prepare for new capital. It was scrapped in 1985, with the De Villiers Commission. So we said, we have not put money aside, so how's funding going to happen? Then we actually received a letter from government that says, look, we want you to build. We endeavor that we'll make sure that you've got the funding. It was not explicit in terms of what the fund is going to come from, but it was just saying we will endeavor to make sure that you have funding. And most of it was based on increased tariffs, that when we increase tariff, we should have money enough to fund capital, which was the problem, because you see capital comes in a lumpy, you invest 100 billion now, so you need the 100 billion now, but you must recover in years. So hence I'm saying, I go back to the point that those decisions were never concluded properly. In fact, one of the concessions that the government did then was to decide that they will give Eskom government guarantees to be able to borrow, right? So they made a decision, and I remember the numbers, about 350 billion of guarantees for Eskom to borrow. But at the end, Eskom ended up incurring 400 billion debt, which government now say they're going to take a part of that. So those are the discussion in terms of Medupi and Kusile and the investment, the funding problems, and so forth. Yeah.
So as I understand it, from the moment NERSA came in, the Eskom was often blocked, or I don't want to now say it's all NERSA's fault, but Eskom was definitely not in a position to execute on its responsibilities because it didn't always have the power to do so. I think that's fair to say, right?
Absolutely. Okay. And again, you're right. It's not NERSA's fault. You see, the NERSA model operates in countries where you've got private sector players right? And you need to regulate, because normally electricity is sort of monopolistic, so it needs a regulator. It's not the market. In some cases, of course, there are free markets. The market will give signals, but in a monopolistic environment, you need a regulator to be able to regulate the price, because the market can't do that. But it works where it's private sector, right? And normally what happens to the private sector, they make the investment, you regulate the return that they make on the invested capital. But the problem is, if you have only one monopoly, and you take away a lot of power from it, but they don't necessarily, and they've got the mandate or the compulsion to build new power stations. Because you see, if it was a free market, in 2007, Eskom could have just said, in the absence of a clear funding structure and a tariff to support new investment, we are not doing it. But Eskom didn't have that choice, right? So in a proper regulated market, the investor can decide, I am not investing because I cannot see the returns, right? But with Eskom, it was compelled, but it didn't have the lever to be able to fund that capital, and hence this is where we are.
Okay, that's very, very, very important information. Now, when Medupi and Kusile was built, the prices skyrocketed, if that's what is being assumed. Is that the case according to you? What went wrong with those power stations that they accumulated so much, cost so much money?
Well, it's really escalation in terms of the work. Now, in any large scale capital projects, you always run the risk of time and cost overruns. And
yes,
then there are strategies to manage those, and there are risk mitigation to manage those. I mean, previously, things like 10 key projects where, the risk is with the people who construct. You as the client, as Eskom, you don't rush the risk, but you pay the price for somebody to take over that risk. But when we're in the market for Medupi and Kusile, most 10 key providers had burned their fingers with large scale, because it was a period of large scale, coal, nuclear build during that time. So either you needed to pay a huge premium to go into a 10 key, all right, or you needed as Eskom to take the risk on. When you take the risk, is that you almost like buy the equipment, but you take the risk of cost overruns and time overruns. And that's how Eskom tried to manage the risk of not taking the premium with 10 key projects. So they broke those projects into work packages and gave different companies, and Eskom was supposed to integrate. In fact, by the time I left, there was also an attempt to bring in integrators. One of them is, I think, Black & Veatch for Kusile, if I'm not mistaken, and BP Power for Medupi, to help Eskom integrate the projects to manage the risk. So it's clear now, in hindsight, that it didn't work. So cost overruns, time overruns, and yes, it happens all over the world. But I think for Medupi and Kusile, it has been, big cost overruns and time overruns. Yeah.
You see how we cut out overruns in Europe, in particular in the nuclear industry and in the oil and gas that I'm quite familiar is we structured the contracts so that the risks are shared by both parties. Okay, so it's like if you build a house, you tell the builder, bring your own finances. I'm not going to give you money and you build. You're going to run away with the money, right? And for example, nuclear, we have this vendor financing system. The customer that brings the plant gets 85 or 90% of the financing, and then the host country pays 10% down, which is usually government money, pension fund. People don't like hearing it often. And that way, if something goes wrong, it's the guy building it that has to fix it. So Finland, for example, last time when the last structure was built, they didn't pay the cost overruns. The French who was building it paid it. So Finland, the country buying it, got a very good deal. Now, when I looked at the Medupi and Kusile contracts, I got the impression that those practices were not always respected, maybe due to inexperienced management at the time or something of the sort. I don't know what your feel is, but it just seems to me that the way the contracts were managed and executed is what allowed for those risks to explode. And as you rightfully say, in any construction EPC contract, the first 5 years is where your high risk is. And if you can get through 5 years, you tend to be okay in OPEX.
True, correct. I mean, you can't sugarcoat it. I think the framework for the construction with Medupi and Kusile in terms of contract management, that's where the flaw came in. And as I say, there was an issue about turnkey, about and the premium thereof. But there was also, to some extent, within Eskom, the feeling that we've done this before. We've done, the big 6 packs. So there is some, capacity within Eskom to do that. But I think history tells us that that wasn't so. And also I think, with the State Capture Commission and other things crept into the build program that just compromised the entire program, from quality of management and, cost management, contract management, and things of that nature. So multitudes of things, I think, crept in, and we are here, where we are. Yeah.
Okay, so now I want to talk maybe on solutions and stuff, because there's, I think, enough history now.
Sure.
South Africa needs generation capacity. I think everyone knows we need power on the grid as soon as yesterday. Okay, what according to you would be the quickest way to run it? Maybe what is your 5-year, 10-year, and 20-year plan? That's sort of what I would ask you.
Firstly, let's just diagnose the issue of power demand, power supply, and where we are. Why do we have load shedding? Firstly, you must go look at energy consumption, total South Africa energy consumption, total country peak demand. Those have been flat or declining for the past maybe 10 years, right?
Per person or in absolute value?
No, absolute value. That is, when you look at, when I left Eskom, the winter peak was in the region of about 35,000 megawatts, right? Today, we struggle to make 34, right? So the peak demand has gone down. When you look at the total energy requirement for South Africa, it has gone down. But what has happened in between? We have built Medupi and Kusile, we've got Ingula, we've got renewable capacity, right? So total installed capacity has gone up. Demand has remained flat or reduced. So the issue, it is not the fact that we don't have enough installed capacity. The problem is that the performance of the installed capacity is poor. From a high of 85 energy availability factor, we're struggling to make mid-50s, right? So what is the problem? The problem is the performance of the current fleet, and mostly the current Eskom fleet, right? So it is not in 2007 in 2008 when we had load shedding. It was an issue of reserve margin. We didn't have enough plant, right? Installed plant. Right? But today is not a matter. The problem is not installed plant; it's performance of installed plant. Now we can debate whether we can go back to higher 80s in terms of performance, because if you go as high as the higher 60% in terms of the current coal fleet, you eliminate load shedding, right? So now there's a debate. Some of them people are saying these plants are old, we need new. My sense is that when you look at the fleet overall, you don't see correlation of performance and age. Some of the older power stations are performing very well, but their peers in terms of age are performing poorly. So there are other factors, not necessarily the age. I can give you an example. Letabo power stations, which is almost the same age as Tutuga, right? Tutuga is performing poorly, but Letabo is sometimes also hits 90%, right? There are other factors. And one of the factors I want to argue is also coal supply. When you look at power stations that have got stable coal supply, that is, they still have their full requirement of coal coming out of the local mine, the dedicated mine, you tend to have better performance because you're not exposed to logistics and managing quality from different locations and so forth. But there are many other things. So
according to you, you would say it's an operational issue. It's not a question that the plant's at the end of the bathtub curve.
It's an operational issue. It's also the issue of funding. I've told about skimming on maintenance and big overhauls, because these plants from time to time you need to do a big outage, and change things and fix things. If you don't do that, it's going to catch up with you. It is operations, it's funding, it's maintenance. Those are the issues. But I think over the past 3 years, and I'll make the point, over the past few years, particularly the past 3 years, there was also a sense of let's abandon coal. It's almost like there's no need in investing in coal if we're transitioning from coal. So if anybody comes and say, look, to get Tutuga to operate at 70%, this is how much billions it requires. The decision will be say, no. Why should we do that if in the next 5 to 7 years we have to close the coal stations?
And here I think we get to the depth of the argument, which I would like to get onto.
And my view, to just conclude this point, my view is that if you believe there is a solution, like renewables are the solution and are the future, you then don't have an appetite to put capital in a dying asset. You rather create an opportunity for the future. And that's where I think we make a huge mistake, because we and anybody else in the world, you cannot run a power system purely on renewables, because the way it works is that it works on the basis of stable power grid, and you can't say I'm replacing coal for renewables. All countries, what they've done, they've added. Now, some countries that have moved from coal, what they've replaced coal with is gas, natural gas. In Europe, it's natural gas.
Germany.
In the US, it's natural gas. So they're not closing their coal station to replace them with renewables. They've added more gas, they've added more renewables. They are able then to start taking out some of their coal. But it is not the way we want to do it, where we say, forget about coal, let's build renewables. That's part of the problem. So the performance part is also part of this abandoning of coal attitude.
So this was an argument I made yesterday morning on an Afrikaans interview, where I said we have ideological-driven solutions and not pragmatic solutions. And I think this is where it comes down to. Now, my view on coal is this. South Africa produces 1% of the world's carbon dioxide, just 1%. Okay, we can fall in the ocean tomorrow. It makes no difference on the temperature of the earth. We are irrelevant. We're not China. We're not America. We're not Europe. Okay, so whatever your stance on climate change is, it makes no difference what we do. Okay, China, just by upgrading their coal fleet, is reducing more CO2 than the entire South Africa. Okay, just by upgrading coal. So my argument with coal has been this. So let me say my first argument. I want to hear you out. I say South Africa must just say we go for mixed for all sources. We are neutral. I'm not against renewable wind, solar, anything. Okay, I'm not against coal, and I'm not against nuclear. I'm in favor of nuclear, to be honest. Go for a mixed system, and at the same time, let's plan, as you say, put those coal power stations online that are dying. Put capital in them. Okay, we need to find capital. I don't know where we're going to get it. Whether it's pension money, I don't care at this stage, because it's for the survival of the state, right? It's an emergency. Put money to get the coal fleet running, okay? Add additional capacity, whether it's gas, and then I make the argument, build nuclear along our coast ASAP so we can solve our water problem simultaneously, because we're running into another issue, which is water. We ran out of water in 2008. And my understanding when I speak to people like Anthony Turton, who knows the water resource issue, it's very similar to Eskom. There's a regulatory framework that is blocking development and investment, and it's the same issue. Okay, so I just like to get your view on the solution, because you say we can take those coal fleets out, we can maintain it, we can run it a lot better, and maybe we can solve load shedding. Is that the easiest path to go, you would think?
Absolutely. So I agree with you. So let me come from being technology agnostic from a power system perspective, right? And then I'll build from there. So the first important issue is it doesn't matter which power system you run. You require dispatchable generation to be able, enough dispatchable generation to be able to run a power grid. Right? Now, that dispatchable generation can come from many sources. It can come from coal, gas, nuclear, hydro, battery storage, right? But you need that dispatchable power to be able to manage the system, number one. Number two, I agree that from a global emission perspective, we're irrelevant. Right? So as you say, we can fall off the face of the earth. The world will feel nothing, right? Because we are such a small contributor. But I also buy into the argument that the people that are talking about emissions are talking that we are going into a world system. If you are a high emitting country, you will get punished with things like carbon border adjustment mechanism of things. The price of carbon may impact on your trade. So even if you're a small country, be aware or factor into your equation that when you trade, those issues will come up. So it will be the issue of trade as opposed to the issue of contributing to emission. That is a. So therefore, what are the solutions going forward? Because we must manage a number of things. We must manage reliable grid. We must manage an affordable grid, but also we must manage emissions from a trade risk perspective. So we must be clear. I mean, if it's trade risk, we must be clear about it, that this is the risk we see in terms of trade, in terms of carbon emissions. So what are the solutions? Firstly, to solve the immediate load shedding, you must sort out the coal fleet performance. That's the immediate solution. Secondly, yes, I agree that there is a place for renewables in terms of, for instance, for the first time now in the world, we've got a technology that commercial enterprises can have options in terms of their power supply. Though the option is limited, in terms of renewables, but renewables plus power, battery storage can mitigate your, energy risk going forward. And it makes commercial sense. The numbers are quite good, but you still have to be tied to the grid to be able to operate any commercial, even household. You still need to be tied to the grid, but just that it gives you a bit of options to mitigate. Now, we are a nuclear country. We've got 2 units that we're running in nuclear, and I posted a picture today. When you look at South Africa, Cuba came in 1984, right? Was commissioned in 1984. China had very little nuclear at that time. China's nuclear power came 10 years later, around 1994, 1995. That's when China started with their nuclear fleet. China has now almost 54 gigawatts of nuclear, while we remained with just under 2 gigawatts, right? So what I'm saying is, when you look at what we could have done with nuclear, if we were not ideologically compromised in terms of nuclear, we could have been using nuclear as part of our decarbonization, because nuclear is a powerful decarbonization, in my view, in many senses. Number one, it's baseload, right? People say, baseload is the old idea, but a source that gives you stable power, it's whichever way you look at it, is still the best. And nuclear is up there with capacity factors of 95%. Right? And of course, it takes time. But of course, infrastructure takes time. There is no instant infrastructure. You don't build the N1 in 2 years. You must build it over many, many years. But once you have built it, it's going to be there for many generations. So you have to have that mentality with nuclear, right? So, and in fact, we cannot only build for 2050 net zero, right? The country doesn't stop in 2050. We need to be saying, what is our long-term trajectory? So what are the things that, yes, we need to do today to meet 2050, but what are the long-term issues? So the solutions for me is fix your coal, consider nuclear, because we're not new to nuclear. Yes, build renewables, and in fact, for the purposes of carbon risk in terms of trade, I mean, you see, you don't even have to close power stations. You see, if you just run like what America and Europe have done, they didn't close power stations. They just upped their renewables. So on a net basis, when you have more renewables in the system, they're going to reduce your emissions. But the coal power stations are still going to give you the stable, reliable power that a renewable cannot give you, right? So so balancing the mix is important for stability and also emissions. So for me, that is my attitude towards.
The only other problem I have, so my argument for renewables is, if you put them in, say, Johannesburg or Pretoria, you're close to the grid, and they're probably cheaper than coal in some cases, I would admit that. But if you put them in a Northern Cape, you have to build a transmission line to the Northern Cape. You have to integrate them. You have to have balancing costs. You need to have peaking plants to counterbalance the entropy. There's a lot of integration costs. Okay. Now, my question to these IPP contractors has always been, who pays for that? Okay. If it's the taxpayer, then you're cherry picking the rate. If you think of it, you should be paying for the full integration cost of that. And when I ask that question, I ask, how affordable are nuclear? Is renewable really in South Africa? Because remember, we're not Europe. Europe and the United States since 1973, since the 73 oil shocks, France is the exception, okay, started privatizing their grids systemically. Okay, so they've already got these levers and counterbalances and peaking gas plants and things to counter the things. South Africa maintained the nationalized grid until now. So if we're going to integrate renewables in a nationalized grid, that's entirely different than putting it in a privatized grid. And what is the cost and who pays for it? Just have you have your view on that.
Yeah, no, absolutely correct. Firstly, I mean, we should also be learning proper lessons from countries that are far advanced in renewable penetration. Because, for instance, the issue that renewables are cheap, when you look at them in an isolated, yes, whenever they are available, the energy they produce may be cheap, but you need to look at the overall system. And there's a correlation between high penetration of renewables and high cost. Why? Because for renewables, you need to balance them with something else. And in the current environment, that is natural gas. And natural gas is priced internationally, so you are exposed to the prices of natural gas. And that's been the case in Europe. That's why they went into a crisis when the gas, the shortage of gas spiked the gas prices. And your renewables cannot help you. You have to rely on gas. So that's the first thing that we need to talk about. Yes, I agree with you. The issue about the integration. Mostly, when we talk about renewables, we never talk about the total cost system for the renewables. What does it cost in the total of the energy system for the renewables, and how do we make sure that that cost is allocated where it's cost? For instance, I mean, I'm sure you know that the renewables in South Africa, they get this 20-year take or pay from Eskom. That's worth a lot in terms of bankability. Number two, the National Treasury actually guarantees that if Eskom doesn't honor their obligation, the National Treasury will step in, right? And that commitment is now about 200 billion, which is sitting in National Treasury, to guarantee the performance of Eskom on renewables. Now, people have said, look, if you took 200 billion and built a nuclear capacity, where would we have been? So there is a hidden cost to this that is not fully transparent to renewables. And once they've got the contract, 20-year contract, guaranteed, take or pay with Eskom, it's money for jam for 20 years.
Well, yes, there's another issue of that. Now you're talking a 20-year life cycle, 15 to 20 years. Now, that worked. These things always work very well when things start. It's the bathtub. And then eventually, what's going to happen here, year 15 or 10 and 12, when things start telling up? And we're seeing signs of Siemens in Germany. We're seeing signs of Saipem, a very big Italian contractor who's lost pension money in the United Kingdom because of soil conditions of offshore wind. We're seeing Sweden pivoting back. Now, I don't know, there are good renewable projects as well. So I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Denmark, I think, has got very good projects. It's now running for 20 plus years. So that seems to be okay for me. And California, I'm not sure what's happening there because prices are also shooting up. So I'm asking myself, what are we buying for something that has to be replaced after 20 years, assuming it works wonderfully? Because it's turning infrastructure into a gold mine. And is that really sustainable? Is that sustainable development? That's what it's branded as. Just have your view on that.
Yeah, absolutely. We need, as I say, we also need to learn from people that are far along the road in terms of did what they promised turn out to be, and what are the issues. Besides the replacement issues, okay, solar panels, maybe 20, 25-year lifespan. But when you talk about batteries and inverters, maybe 5 to 10 years. So what's going to happen? But the other issue also is performance. In the US, in the US, there's an authority or an institution called the North American Electricity Reliability Corporation, NEC. They are tasked from a regulation point of view to look at reliability. And they've been reporting for the past maybe 7 years, performance of what is called inverter-based resources, which are normally, solar and wind, where they've had performance issues. Without going into technicalities, in a grid, any grid will experience faults. Faults from power stations tripping or big loads tripping. Now, any power station has to have what is called fault right-through capability. So you see the fault, but you still operate. But what has happened with some of these inverter solar, particularly solar, large-scale solar, when they see the fault, they actually, in the US, they use the word, they panic and then they disconnect from the grid. Now, when you've got a fault and you disconnect prematurely, you're making the problem bigger. And those are the issues that I think are emerging in Australia. South Australia, they had actually a full blackout related to the performance of their renewable generation, because how they react to the fault. So those are still things that I think people don't talk about, but I think that you need to start thinking about. Once we have a high penetration of renewable resources, there are certain technical issues, cost issues, performance issues that you need to understand. For South Africa, unfortunately, we're still in an ideological mode where renewable seems like they produce miracle electrons and everything. It's like, when we have a lull in load shedding, it's because of the wind and solar, but you've got 5,000 or 6,000 megawatts of wind and solar, and you still have about 40,000 megawatts of the rest.
I'll tell you this. A friend of mine the other day said to me, he knows somebody who's now bragged to him that he's installed 1 million solar panels in South Africa. And I don't know if this is true or not. And I said, well, we've got 1 million solar panels and we haven't solved load shedding yet. I can give you 3 nuclear stations, probably there, So it's just the amount, I would say that the hype of these things makes me very skeptical. Okay. The other question I've got for you is this. So South Africa's energy per person is about the same as China. The Chinese have now gone above us, I think 2015 or so. The last 5 years, they've really accelerated, but per person, because China's just got this massive population. In the United States, it's still 4 times as high as South Africa. Now, as you'd probably know, in energy, you have what was called Jevons paradox. The more you consume, the higher your demand keeps on getting, because the human need keeps on getting infinite. Now, the old argument before renewables came in would be we need to get where the United States is. We need to replace our coal fleet, or maintain it, and double it again. Okay, that was the argument in the past. But now when renewables came in, they say, no, but renewables are more efficient because you don't lose 2/3 of energy in the Rankine cycle. So the argument is we're going to maybe hit somewhere in the middle on the renewables. So I don't know if you have a reflection on how much capacity we really need to get everyone out of poverty and really develop the society.
Look, I mean, I don't have the details of those calculations, but I think the broad theme is that there's a relationship between development and energy in a country, and where we are from, when you look at per capita, we're still very low in terms of energy per capita, and even China, even with this massive growth, is still probably lower. And the idea is that if you're going to restrict energy availability to developing countries and begin to measure them with the standards of developed countries, because they've had this massive benefit and they've developed on the back of energy, and most of that energy come from emitting technologies. And in fact, we're in a climate crisis, not because of the entire world, but it's because of the Industrial Revolution, which benefited mostly the Western countries. But we are now hit with restrictions to develop. In fact, I was thinking, the other day that, I mean, a just thing would have been America or the Western world is not about reducing emission. You must find technologies to take it out of the atmosphere, because you put it there in the first place, right? So until you do that, we need to develop, because whatever we're putting in, I mean, it will never be, when you look at the historical emissions, even China doesn't match the historical emissions of the US and Europe, right? So the justice in the thing is that those that have benefited most from the development based on emitting technologies should actually do much, much more and allow others to still continue. And as you say, when you look at South Africa and Africa as a whole, its contribution to the CO2 emission, you can wipe Africa out of the map. You are not solving the climate crisis.
Well, the issue, the argument I've made, and it's an article with a co-author of mine is coming in National Review, and I might as well tell the listeners here, is we need to forget about mitigation. We can do it where it's applicable. But you're not, by the end of this century, this is numbers that should scare any African leader. If there's 10 people on Earth, 4 of them will be African, 4 of them will be Asian, and 1 or 2 is in Europe. And 1 is in Europe and 1 is in North and South America combined. And Australia is a rounding error. Okay, that's the population. So Africa's population will be as big as Asia. Asia has not lifted everyone out of poverty yet. China still has a population the size of the United States that has to be lifted out of poverty. China is probably still going to double its generation capacity. Okay, India is not even close to doubling and doubling again. Okay, Africa is going to climb on that ladder because of the demand of the population. You cannot suppress that desire to live like Europeans. Otherwise, there's going to be migration. Okay, that in Europe, you can see the European attitude to migration is not that nice at the moment because it's putting their systems under strain. So the argument we make is mitigate where you can. So upgrade your coal if you have to. Okay, put solar and wind if you can. Put nuclear if you can. Doesn't matter. But at the end of the day, electricity is only 10% of all carbon emissions. Only 10%. We need steel. We need concrete. We need all these other things that are CO2. So rather adapt to a warmer climate. It's more proportionate. accept there's going to be warming and say we're going to adapt. We're going to buy air conditioners for everyone. Whatever we need to do, it's been done before. So I just like get your view that maybe our government's policies, our government is trying to take policies that are invented for European countries. It doesn't even seem to work in Europe, because look at what happened in France with the Gilets jaunes in 2018, trying to impose it on a population that's got a fraction of the world's CO2 and energy consumption and lots of poverty. And then they wonder why people are pushing back against this.
Look, true. I mean, not also looking at it as isolated as South Africa. I think it's whether the global climate conversation is pragmatic in terms of the realities on the ground. I mean, those realities about whether we can completely transform the energy system, which by and large is still over 80% based on emitting technologies, whether that is realistic in the timeframes. People do other calculations in terms of what materials are you going to require to completely rewire the energy systems. The copper that you need, the cobalt, the lithium, the nickel, because you are completely throwing away the current generation, particularly the generation system, and building a new one. Is it realistic that in the next 2 decades, we will be able to move from a system that is about 80% now across the energy requirement? So you're going to change the energy, 80% of what we depend on, you're going to add in terms of electrification, because part of this energy transition is electrifying whatever you can. I mean, vehicles, some of the heating, steel making are going to now depend more on electricity. And that electricity will come from a totally different source from what we are used to. So the question is it realistic? And indeed, you are right. If indeed climate is a reality, climate change is the reality, whichever way you look at it, whether you still want for 2050, we need to also in parallel think about mitigation and also accepting that not all of this is going to happen. So the climate is still going to rise. And indeed, if the science is correct, we're still going to have other climate-related issues that we must deal with. Because I don't see, I mean, this system has been built over 200, maybe over 200 years, right? And we've moved, even the countries, I mean, when you look at Germany, that has spent a lot of money for the past 20 years, but they've not moved, significant amount. So if you say the whole world must move, can it happen with the time frame? And how much mining are you going to do?
And are you going to convince the Chinese and the Indians to go along with it?
Exactly.
And if they are not going along with it, why should the Africans go along with it?
Absolutely.
That's the next question.
Absolutely.
So,
but I think maybe just to add, for me, as you see, now bringing it to a country, what I would want as a country is not to just respond, but we need, you see, like for instance, China is taking advantage of the transition. They have organized themselves to be the largest supplier of anything that is renewable. They've taken over solar, they're now 90%. They've taken 97% of the wafers that go into the solar panels, both in terms of material and technology. They are taking over wind, they are taking over battery. So they're saying, it doesn't matter what you guys are saying, we will build whatever equipment that are going to be required in the new system. We're going to build it, and that's part of our industrial strategy, right? And so. But what are they also doing? They are using cheap energy from coal to dominate the entire supply chain of renewables. They are still building coal, and part of why their solar panels are cheap and the equipment are cheap is they've hardwired cheap energy particularly from coal, into their manufacturing processes. So what is the lesson there? South Africa, is not big enough to change the global climate agenda. The question is, whatever we do, it should be saying, how do we use this? You see, just closing down your coal and replacing them with panels, it is not an industrial strategy, right? But if you're saying, how do we climb the industrial, ladder, and factor in things are going to be required in this energy system, then you are talking. You're not just reacting. Now, as China, from 20 years ago, they've been working on this thing. Now, they've closed down, mineral supplies. For instance, most of the cobalt that comes out of the Congo, it goes to China. So it's being strategic in this debate as opposed to just fighting.
But I think that is what's missing in all we talk about is there's a lack of long-term strategic thinking.
Absolutely.
And there's a lack of clear policy to execute. But
right.
You see, part of this debate becomes a philosophical debate as to what is the role of government. Okay, and in South Africa, we've never really figured out what to do. We inherited utilities from the apartheid regime, which was by and large a European social democracy type of thing, mainly for the white population. And then we came in 1994 and we say we're going to run it like the Americans and the British in a free market society. But we kept the old system. So we kept the monopolies and we tried to run a free market. And somewhere along the wheels, the policies became inconsistent. So I guess we're going to speak in this last point here because we've gone on for some time. What do you think is the right industrialization path for South Africa?
I think that's an important question. But the thing is, you see, firstly, shortly, let me just talk about the industrial path for the past 100 years, right? So, and energy being part of that. Basically, I think in the beginning of the 20th century, when the English discovered how much minerals are there, particularly, firstly, in the Transvaal, then they actually organized the political system to make sure that the entire South Africa is within the control of the British, because the unity of South Africa was nothing else but minerals. Right?
Yeah.
Right. So we are built. The industrial economic base of South Africa has been built on minerals. Gold, diamonds, now platinum, and we are endowed. But we have never moved up the chain of the minerals to processing, to manufacturing. Right. So for me, the issue is we're still endowed with lots of minerals. We still have lots of platinum. We still, manganese, chrome, which are still, we are still a huge area of, we've got lots of deposit in relation to ranked in the world. So I think part of our industrialization still has to include minerals, but we move up the chain and process them more. Do a lot of manufacturing, right? But the general attitude for me, which is the issue without actually saying this or the other, the general attitude should be, and we should spend a lot of time on this topic. What is our industrial and economic strategy? And how do we take all the factors in the world around that strategy, including what type of energy should we be focusing on as part of our industrial strategy? Also, we as a regional power, how do we influence events around us in our region to be a powerful bloc to interface with the rest of the world? Now, for instance, the issue of green hydrogen. Europe is actually betting on green hydrogen because part of the European energy strategy is to say, for now, we use gas more, right, to offset emissions, but to get a stable power.
Yeah.
But they're thinking of, we need to be thinking about how we use the gas infrastructure for green hydrogen and how to adapt that for green hydrogen. Right? So green hydrogen is going to be big. And because of our sun in South Africa, our hydro in the region, shouldn't we be thinking about that as a regional strategy? Because green hydrogen, whichever way you look at it, green hydrogen is going to be a big part of the debate or the inputs.
Next to the ocean, but you see, with that, my challenge is South Africa's water is a big crisis. So before you have hydrogen, you need water, right? And then you have energy density. So there's lots of issues. I mean, I'm not in disagreement necessarily, right? But we need to, what I would agree with is this. South Africa needs to figure out what is our geopolitical strategy, our strategy for the survival of the state, grand strategy, if you will. Part of that, I think, has to fall in for diplomacy, which is so far what the Minister Naledi Pandor is saying about non-alignment makes sense to me. We are too small a country to pick a fight with another country in the world, right? So let's do what India has done historically, stay out of conflicts and just lock them into negotiations. That means we should maybe not be too close to Putin, but we can also not say yes to the Americans necessarily. But that should also apply to our energy strategy. So in our energy strategy, if we can go for technologies, because we are so small in the world, we need to get all the great powers. And we say to the Chinese and the Americans and the Russians, come put your power stations and your technologies here and operate them. And we try and learn from all of them how to do this with technology. That should be my view. And then we try and stay neutral to whatever technology comes into place. And so we must have some policy that accommodates that. Now, I mean, that's very simplistic that I've shown. But before we start talking about what minerals and what investment and thing, we need to understand the geopolitical supply chains. Because I think if we're going to be, otherwise we're going to remain a mine for the rest of the century if we continue that way.
Look, let me just give you an example. I agree, because I'm giving an example, not necessarily specific. The green hydrogen is an example. Let me just give you a discussion. I mean, part of the discussions in the late 2000s about nuclear, because we were at the verge of a big nuclear procurement. But part of that strategy was that if we're going to go nuclear, we'd rather go big and go fleet. And in going big and going fleet, it gives us the leverage to say, if we're going to give you our program, any country that is interested, if we're going to give you our program, part of the condition is that you have to set up a manufacturing capability in South Africa for certain part of this, of the components of the nuclear ecosystem, right? So it's that kind of thinking, because if we did, we actually spend a lot of time and money in, understanding that strategy and seeing what parts of South Africa are going to, what institutions, what entities will be part of that strategy. So I agree with you, but that is also geopolitical, because you needed, at some point, you then need to choose. If I'm going with France in terms of nuclear, I'm locking myself into that geopolitical, configuration. But it's that kind of thinking that you must have in any. So the energy must come as part of the broader, both industrial, geopolitical strategy of South Africa, the region, and how the world operates today. Yeah.
Mm. And it's really the final question. Do you have a view on the role of the non-governmental organizations, these NGOs that have been blocking the nuclear power plant, for example, and seem to be against opening up the coal plants again and things of that sort? What should we do about them?
Well, look, I think, with democracy comes other things. When you open up democracy, other things comes in. But I don't necessarily think you should focus on the NGOs. I think we should, you see, what I find is that unless the state is clear in terms of what it wants to do, anybody can stop them. It is that lack of clarity for me, and if you're clear in terms of what you want to do, you don't then put in laws that are going to be used against you, right? So because the NGOs are using, laws and courts,
yeah.
And because those laws exist and those courts must interpret them, then you get caught. But so you cannot just. In fact, you need to be clear, and being clear also means what laws and regulations that you need to put in place to be able to, because that way, then you can move. Otherwise, you get tripped by your own laws that you've made.
All right, I think that's a very good answer. So Jacob Maroga, thank you very much for this conversation on Eskom, and please everyone follow him on Twitter. He's actually quite active there, and he posts very intelligent things. And thank you again for sharing your experience.
Thank you very much. Thank you.